Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson, and I am an author. And these are my books. One of these books, this one right here, The Heart of the World, employs the writing method we're going to be talking about today. So if you want to see it in action, you should go give this a read after, Anyway, when we think of genres, at least in terms of storytelling, we usually focus on one or two things. We either focus on the aesthetic, like steampunk or sci-fi, or we focus on the overall tone and feel of the story, like horror or action-adventure. We usually combine these two types to a more clear picture, like steampunk horror or dark fantasy. Now, this kind of picture of painting a genre tends to leave out what I think is one of the best ways to really heighten the emotion of a given scene, and that is to write clashing tones. So, on a whole, I'm not really the biggest fan of horror. I've played a horror video game here or there, but all in all, I don't really engage with the genre. But I've noticed something kind of strange. When I do dip my toes into the genre, I don't actually find it very scary a lot of the time. When I played through Signalis, for instance, I really loved it, but I wouldn't say I was particularly scared, and when I played through Dredge and the two Subnautica games, I even thought they were super chill despite ostensibly being horror games. There are exceptions to this. I was plenty scared during Doki Doki Literature Club and Little Nightmares 1 and 2, but by and large, these games just don't usually scare me. And part of me thought, it's just because they're video games. In addition to writing, I also study game design, so maybe I just cracked the code on these games mechanically and that took the horror out of it. But I'd say I was never particularly scared when reading H.P. Lovecraft or Hypnagogia. I think that's how you say it. I'll link that one in the description because it's a relatively obscure book. Give it a read. It's great. But despite how not scared I usually am when taking all of this super scary media in, want to know a piece of media that absolutely terrified me? Steven Universe. Yes, that Steven Universe. Particularly the episode Keeping It Together. In this episode, we're introduced to a new kind of monster that just totally freaks me out. Without going too much in detail, there are these monsters that use bits and pieces of people's souls and, forcibly mashes them together into these freaky-looking fusion creatures. And this is probably the scariest scene in any piece of media I've ever seen, and while rewatches don't scare me as much as it did the first time, I would be lying if I said this scene didn't still scare me. And not only that, but every appearance of these fusion experiments is kind of scary, even though they're not even that threatening. And that's weird, right? I've seen people who are way more used to horror and all the tropes than I am, and they've gone to say things like Subnautica is the scariest game they've ever played, or how Signalis felt so claustrophobic and depressive, and I'm just over here like, these games are fun, woohoo! And yet, at the same time, I'm getting scared by Steven Universe, of all things? What's going on here? Steven Universe shouldn't be scary. But as strange as it sounds, I think the fact that Steven Universe doesn't feel like it should be scary is exactly why it was. When I first start a horror game or a horror book, the scariest part for me is always right at the beginning, when I don't really know what I'm getting myself into, when I first dip my toe into the water. Yet, almost without fail, as the story goes on, the horror just kind of disappears. By trying to be scary all the time, these stories stop scaring me. I get used to their tone and their themes and their world, and whatever scary grip they might have had on my brain at first just fades away. But when I'm experiencing a story that's not trying to be scary all the time, it's something I'm not used to. Doki Doki Literature Club's whole vibe, for instance, is it pretends to be a cutesy dating sim, when it's actually a psychological horror game. The entire first half of the game is all about crafting this safe space, and it plays it totally straight, only to suddenly rip you out at the halfway point with one of the hardest scenes I've ever had to watch. Steven Universe was the same way. The show wasn't usually trying to be scary, it felt like a safe space. So when it was scary, it was very jarring, and the horror is that much better for it. This is the essence of clashing tones. The idea is simply that when your story is composed of two or more main parts, one part will have one tone, and another part will have another. I used horror up until this point, but this works with far more than just horror. There's a really great comic that I like called I Was Born to Work Retail, link in the description, language warning, but it's pretty great. In I Was Born to Work Retail, any given issue is either going to be this silly exaggeration of what it's like to work a retail job that's usually pretty funny, or it's going to be the main character Jenny having a mental breakdown. During the episodes where Jenny is having a really, really hard time, you feel really bad for her, like, come on, just give this girl a break, you know? And it makes the episode where things are a lot more chill such a nice change of pace. Like, I'm glad I just get to see her happy for an issue or two. She deserved it after all the crap she just went through. I have always found clashing tones like this to be really effective storytelling, heightening the emotions of both of the tones you're smashing together, where the lows are lower and the highs become higher. But it's kind of tricky. For one, a lot of media is carefully crafted to appeal to people who like to engage with a particular tone. A dark fantasy, for instance, is catered to people who like dark stories, and going back to the example of Doki Doki Literature Club, I picked it up because I already knew it was a psychological horror game. If I was under the impression that it actually was just a cutesy dating sim, I would have never given it a chance. There's a non-zero chance that by the very nature of clashing tones like this, you may draw in the wrong audience, and when the tone shifts, you'll have an audience present that just doesn't like the new tone and might stop reading, watching, playing, etc. And on the same note, since the tone you convey at first glance might drive away people who would be interested in the other side of your story. And unfortunately, this is something that I don't think really has a solution, at least, not as far as I know. But let's say you're willing to take that risk. In that case, how would you go about crafting the story to properly heighten the emotions you're wanting to heighten? Well, the more you have any given tone in the story, the more numb the audience will get to it. The way Doki Doki Literature Club handles it, and to a lesser extent the way I handled it in my book, The Heart of the World, is the first and biggest tone clash will happen about halfway through. This one should be saved for the big plot twist, so that big crucial moment is all the more impactful. From that point on, it's kind of tough to go back. Doki Doki Literature Club takes off the mask and goes full horror at that point, and the latter half of Heart of the World is a lot more downcast than the first half. This method plays off a big initial shock and then mellows out to separate the tones by each half of the story. Doki Doki Literature Club does actually pick up and backpedal on the horror stuff through its side stories, which are actually my favorite part of the game, but man, the fact that you need to watch all these horrible things happen to all these characters to watch some unironically cute and wholesome stories about them is the most Doki Doki Literature Club thing ever, isn't it? Anyway, this method works fine, but it's not the only way to do things. Another method is the one we see in I Was Born to Work Retail. The general structure of I Was Born to Work Retail is you have a longer, more drawn-out and serious plotline that explores Jenny's mental state and puts her through the ringer, and then there are a few episodes after that are just silly episodic stuff, maybe setting up some things for the next plotline, but she just gets to be happy for a few episodes. And then we get back to the serious stuff. Steven Universe does this to a lesser extent as well, where those spooky fusion monsters only show up in a few episodes every now and then, with regular Steven Universe antics going on in between. This method will never hit the same intense emotions of the first one. Since you're oscillating back and forth, the audience has more time to get used to both tones of the story. But it has the advantage of feeling a lot more realistic, in my opinion. Life rarely has a consistent tone. No matter how bright the sun shines, it always goes back to rain. Maybe weather-wise, that metaphor works better the other way around, but in real life I find rain is the default. Jenny's life in I Was Born to Work Retail feels very real. Exaggerated, sure, but real. It's easy for me to suspend my disbelief in this story because it feels like no matter what Jenny does, no matter how happy a given episode might be, she's going to be dealing with the same problems in the end. Her life always goes back to rain. And that's one of the big advantages of this method, is it feels very real. There is no single tone that life takes. It oscillates. But beyond that, this method is also nice because you don't ever have to abandon one of the tones. Not counting its side stories, Doki Doki Literature Club completely loses its ability to put you back in that safe space after you've been torn out of it. But I Was Born to Work Retail never completely pulled you out of it, so it can let you back in. You'll know that it's just going to be temporary, but it's still there. But okay, there's one part about all of this that I've been kind of glossing over a little bit, but it's something really important. When you have clashing tones like this, your audience might not know what kind of story they're getting into. And I think it's very, very important to let them know. There's a big discussion about whether or not to use trigger warnings in stories, and depending on your stance, you might think this kind of clashing tone storytelling is the worst place to put a trigger warning. You're spoiling the big twist after all. But it's the opposite. Trigger warnings are important no matter what kind of story you're writing, but if you're dealing with the kind of topic that usually needs a trigger warning, these kinds of stories are the most important place to use them. A lot of people who don't have a trauma response to something don't realize what a trauma response is really like, I don't think. A trauma response is not a small thing. It's not a, ew, that was gross, or scary. A trauma response is very visceral and intense. It feels almost like your brain is shutting down on you and you can't process what's going on. The most intense one I have ever had was almost like I blacked out. I was listening to something on the radio and it triggered a trauma response. I suddenly felt very cold and my head started to feel like it was filling up and was about to explode, and the next thing I know, the car I was in had reached its destination and someone was yelling at me for ignoring them. Something like 10 minutes had passed, and the entire time I felt very cold and sick, and it hurt, and my brain was literally blotting out all the sound around me because it didn't want to hear what was on the radio. And even worse, when I got out of the car, it didn't end there. It never reached that level of intensity again, but for the next week, the words that I heard on the radio kept echoing through my head, triggering another, albeit lesser version of that same feeling. These are the kinds of experiences that trigger warnings are meant to help avoid, and you should always put the mental well-being of your audience before any worries you have about spoiling the plot twist. In addition, if I see a trigger warning, then I also just trust the author more. I trust that they're not just throwing this subject into the book for the sake of shock value, that they're handling it with an awareness that it's a real thing and can cause real pain. And if you're worried that it's going to ruin the safe space you're trying so hard to craft in the first part of your book, don't be. I went into Doki Doki Literature Club 100% knowing what it was going to be. And that big major tone clash halfway through the story, I already knew what that was. Someone had explained it to me. That's why I picked up the game in the first place, actually. Yet, I was still able to get pulled into that safe space just fine, even though I knew that's what the story was doing. So, there we have it. I hope this has been helpful, but that's all from me, and I'll see you in another video.